I'd like to welcome you to the first Dean's Forum on Global Affairs. It was actually the second, so you can also tell Kevin Rudd that you became the first because he canceled. The forum is designed to bring world leaders into conversation with the Notre Dame students, faculty, and the broader community around current challenges shaping global affairs. We're thrilled to have you here to join us for a conversation on the future of international aid, especially at a time when the world's most vulnerable communities need our attention more than ever. Today we are joined by David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Since 2013, David has led the IRC in its mission to help people whose lives have been disrupted by conflict, disaster, and displacement. Under his leadership, the IRC operates in over 40 countries and provides refugee resettlement and assistance programs across Europe and the Americas. Before joining the IRC, David had a distinguished career in British politics. He served as the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010, becoming the youngest person to hold that office in 3 decades. Prior to that, he was a member of Parliament for South Shields from 2001 to 2013. Throughout his career, he's been a passionate advocate for human rights, global cooperation, and humanitarian action. David is also a leading voice on how the international aid system can adapt and improve to meet today's complex challenges. This afternoon, we're fortunate to hear his perspective on what's working, what's under strain, and what the future could look like. Thank you, and join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I really appreciate it. It's nice to be here in South Bend in Indiana, and very nice to be here at the Keough School. Thank you very much to Mary Gallagher, your dean. I wish you hadn't told me that I was actually the second global forum, but I'll take it that Kevin Rudd's apologies on Saturday means that I'm vaulted up into this newly exalted position. I think it's really important in an NGO where you are confronted every day by the people who need you to take time to step back and think about the big picture. In government, you're confronted by the big picture every day, and the danger is that you lose sight of the people that you're serving. In NGO, you're confronted by the people you're serving, the danger is that you lose sight of the big picture. And I'm very grateful to you, Mary, and to the team here for giving me the chance to meet students and faculty, and also to then set out some ideas about the future of international aid. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then really look forward to questions, comments, and other contributions. I want to just start by making a link between this university and this school and the International Rescue Committee. The university and the school, it seems to me, from what I've read and learned, combines local roots and service with global vision and conscience. And that combination of local and global is what motivated the creation of the International Rescue Committee by Albert Einstein in the 1930s. Since then, we've worked with successive US governments to welcome about 3 million refugees to America and to integrate them into American life, and worked with government, with philanthropists, and with the private sector to fund and deliver the leading edge of humanitarian aid around the world. Last year, we helped over 36 million people through our international work, and that's my focus today. America's role in international aid has been thrust close to the center of political debate since January of this year. The new administration has closed institutions of governance, it's torn up assumptions of policy, and it's cut drastically the scale of funding. America is so central to the global aid system that it's as if the anchor has been pulled up just as the seas are getting rougher, leaving the entire humanitarian vessel rocking at the worst possible moment. But what comes next, either for American policy, the aid system, or the world's poorest, is not clear at all. And I'm going to focus on the future today, not on the past. My purpose is to set out what I think aid should be for, how it should be delivered, and who should pay for it. And in summary, as a kind of spoiler alert for those of you who want to think in Twitter length, not just half a lecture length, in summary, we need international aid to be different, not smaller, with more funds devoted to proven programs that help the extreme poor, more innovation in funding and delivery, and more alignment between economic and social interventions. My view is that American policy can and should play a positive and even uniting role across the country in making these shifts, because a well-functioning aid system, an international aid system, is not just morally right, it's also in America's interests. And that's what I'm going to try and develop today. I want to start with 4 statements about where things stand. I'm sorry I need to say this, but they are all true. But they point in different directions. They point to competing narratives about the future of the aid system. Statement 1. Extreme poverty is defined as income of $3 a day or less, and the World Bank recently revised up its estimate of the number of people in this situation to 831 million, a little more than 10% of the world's population. Statement 2. There's never been more evidence about which aid programs work with most impact and most cost effectiveness. And I'm glad to have a chance to meet the Pulte Institute today. I'm really sorry about the funding losses that you've suffered. And there's a man who's got a T-shirt that says, "Your research matters," and I fully agree with that on his T-shirt. So there's more evidence about what works. At IRC, we've been at the heart of this drive, doing between 20 and 25% of all impact studies in humanitarian settings and 400 cost effectiveness and cost efficiency studies. Statement 3, maybe the most surprising. A detailed poll of the American public by the University of Maryland in February of this year found that the majority of respondents think that 20% of the global aid budget, 20% of the US federal budget goes on global aid. Now here's the interesting thing. When asked whether 1% of the US federal budget should go on foreign aid, and 1% is more or less the actual figure for the amount that America spends on foreign aid, fully 89% of those polled, including 84% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats, answered yes. Health interventions are even more popular than that. And then statement 4, America represented about 30% of the global aid budget in 2024. 30%. Since January, the administration has eliminated more than 80% of its international aid programs, though not 80% of the funding, on the grounds that they represent the most egregious waste and abuse amongst federal spending. According to McKinsey, US health funding will be cut to almost half its 2022 level. So those are the 4 statements. My contention is that until we reconcile these competing truths, we won't be able to define a sustainable future for international aid. My approach starts with the purposes of aid, and more particularly, the pathway to achieve its goals. I think there are 2 such pathways. They overlap, but they're distinct. One pathway is to focus on helping poor countries develop their economies. The other is to help poor people improve their condition. For a long time, the former, the first pathway, development, was seen as the way to address the latter, the demand of fighting poverty. The rationale was simple and powerful. If you help poor countries develop, then you'll help poor people out of poverty. Fighting poverty and promoting development were almost synonymous. The international measure for funding the fight against poverty is actually called official development assistance. Now, the evidence shows the impact, especially but not only in global health. From the 50-year vaccination campaign that's estimated to have saved 150 million lives, to the US-led PEPFAR program focused on AIDS that's estimated to have saved 25 million lives. From 1990 to 2015, the number of people living in extreme poverty fell by an average of 52 million people a year, even as the population rose. But the relationship between promoting development in poorer countries and fighting poverty among poor people, and especially amongst the poorest people, has changed in the last 30 years. Here's what's happened. Development has been predominantly driven by combinations of home and global markets, including property rights, effective governance, debt relief, and to some extent remittances. Countries like China, India, Vietnam, Ghana, South Korea, which have achieved the biggest reductions in poverty and the greatest gains in development, have been transformed. From a situation in 1987 where every single country in South Asia was classified as low income, today the figure is 13%. My point is that aid has been and continues to be helpful to the poor in those countries, but it's not been the big driver of development. Poverty, on the other hand, has become concentrated not in poor states, or is less defined by being in poor states. Poverty is defined by war-torn states. The World Bank calls them fragile and conflict-affected situations. In 1990, less than 1 in 10 of the extreme poor lived in conflict-affected countries. Today, over 50% of the global extreme poor live in conflict-affected states. And the figure is expected to rise to 2/3 by 2030. Fully 40% of the population in a fragile or conflict state lives on less than $3 a day, compared to 6% in other emerging and developing economies. So these states where instability and risk preclude development and immiserate the population are the defining challenge for the aid system. And just to capture an additional element that I think is important, 19 of the 25 countries at the bottom of the Notre Global Adaptation Initiative Index, which measures climate vulnerability, 19 of the 25 countries measuring that climate vulnerability fall into this fragile and conflict-affected group. So challenges of conflict and climate increasingly go together. However, while extreme poverty is increasingly defined by conflict, aid budgets are not. Does that mean misspeaking? So let me just repeat that. While extreme poverty is increasingly defined by states marked by conflict, aid budgets are not biased towards those states. In fact, the aid budget is spread increasingly thin. 10% of the $210 billion official global aid budget goes to humanitarian aid, and 13% to health. According to the OECD, spending on quote-unquote global public goods, which are cross-border issues like climate mitigation, biodiversity, refugee support, and infection prevention, grew to be 60% of Development Assistance Committee members' international assistance. Now, I'm not saying these are not important causes, reasons to spend, but here's the thing. Money for global public goods is generally spent in middle-income countries rather than in the poorest countries. In total, across the aid budget, 45% of aid flows to lower middle-income and upper middle-income countries, not to the poorest countries. It's also worth noting 2 other points about aid spend. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine has become the biggest global aid recipient. Not military aid, aid. Foreign aid. Non-military aid. Before the invasion, the largest recipient of international aid was Bangladesh in 2020 and 2021. Furthermore, so that's worth noting. Second point worth noting, European countries are increasingly spending funds classified as quote-unquote overseas aid on refugee integration at home. In the first year of refugee integration, you're allowed to classify that as quote-unquote overseas aid. The figure is around 13% of the total aid bill, about the same as that which is spent on health. My point is not that it's bad to spend money on the integration of Ukrainian refugees, it's that if you're spending it in a rich country, you shouldn't call it overseas aid. All of this is to say that now is the time for a rethink about the future of international aid, what it's for, how it's delivered, and how it's paid for. And that's what I'm going to turn to now. And I'm going to make 5 points about the future of international aid. First, we need to focus grant aid, which is over 90% of the global aid budget, the rest being concessional loans and public-private partnerships, on the poorest people in the poorest places. Because grant aid is all that those people have in Sudan or Gaza, parts of Bangladesh for Rohingya refugees. And that means addressing the mismatch between the more or less 50% of the extreme poor who currently live in fragile and conflict states and the approximately 25% of the global aid budget that goes to those countries. In 2023, 42% of aid went to fragile and conflict states, but only if you include Ukraine. If you take Ukraine out of it, the percentage of US aid that goes to fragile and conflict states is only 22%, even though 50% going up to 65% of the extreme poor live in those places. At the IRC, we've run the numbers on which countries are dependent on US aid, have a UN humanitarian response plan, are highly dependent on grant-funded ODA, Overseas Official Development Assistance, are at risk of or in debt distress, and are conflict and climate affected. It produces a subset of 13 countries most desperate for international grant aid. Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, CAR, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, Mali, Mozambique, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Yemen. I think the reason Gaza is not in that list is because it gets so little US aid. So you could add that to be a 14. 29% of the world's extreme poor live in that subset of hardest hit countries. 29%. But only 9% of global official development assistance is allocated to those 13 countries. The difference is worth about $35 billion. Now, for countries that are stable, concessional loans and support for private sector instruments can work well. In many cases, like Kenya or Bangladesh or Lebanon, they're hosting refugees from neighboring states caught up in conflict. And the role of organizations like the US Development Finance Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, can be powerful. When they're paired with effective domestic resource mobilization, taxes, they can be pivotal. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that the private sector is going to ride to the rescue of the poorest people in the fragile and conflict states. Second point, we don't just need geographic focus for grant aid, we need programmatic focus. We need to pile resource behind evidence-based, proven, cost-effective programming, like the community-based vaccine drive that IRC has pioneered in East Africa, delivering 20 million vaccine shots for $2 a shot. Or our proposal for a combined and simplified protocol for diagnosing and treating moderate and severe acute malnutrition, which in our study involving 27,000 kids in Mali delivered cost efficiency savings of 30%. This is the kind of focus that will take a change of approach from donors so that their efforts aggregate impact rather than dilute it. And when I talk about donors diluting their impact, think about this. The president of the Center for Global Development has called for a radical simplification of foreign assistance budgets. She's called Rachel Glenister. She was formerly the chief economist at the UK Department for International Development. She's explained that the median ODA project, Official Development Assistance Project, is worth less than $100,000. So imagine the bureaucratic cost that's associated with administering grants of $100,000. It's seriously inefficient. And our own cost-effectiveness work shows the inefficiencies of small scale. This drive to aggregate impact rather than dilute it also means spurring radical alignment of bilateral assistance projects. At the moment, Charles Kenny of the CGD, Centre for Global Development, has shown that aid partnerships, bilateral aid partnerships from rich countries to poor ones, are in over 90% of cases worth less than a high school renovation project in Indiana. Now, it turns out a high school renovation project in Indiana is actually quite expensive. It's $100 million, apparently, for a high school renovation project in Indiana. But nonetheless, for bilateral aid to have 90% of the bilateral aid projects less than $100 million is inefficient for donors and for recipient countries. So we need to pile money behind the most effective programs at scale. Third, we need innovation in programs, in finance, and in delivery. Programs first. AI, we're using AI to cut disease diagnosis times from 2 weeks to 5 minutes in Democratic Republic of Congo at the moment. We've shown how to use anticipatory cash transfers, in other words, getting money to people in advance of a flood rather than afterwards, is far more efficient and allows communities to anticipate problems, protect their livelihoods, and actually come out stronger. We've also shown how AI can achieve impressive learning outcomes for kids whose education is interrupted. Not everything needs tech. We use low-tech solutions, for example, an upper arm circumference measurement to diagnose malnutrition. But there is a tech revolution underway, and it's doubly unfair for the poorest people in the world not to get the benefit of it. To do that, we're going to need risk capital, with a readiness to learn and accept failure in the interest of finding new ways of helping people out of poverty. I would never in government have boasted that 40% of projects fail. But in our impact fund, which is a small part of our research and development function, we do boast that 40% of our impact projects fail, because if we weren't getting a failure rate, we wouldn't be trying anything radical enough in our projects. We also need financial innovation. I've got an article in the Financial Times tomorrow about this. There's a stark reality that the global debt burden of poor countries is incompatible with fighting poverty and overcoming dependence. Over 70% of fragile and conflict states are in or at high risk of debt distress, up sharply from a decade ago. So the macroeconomics have to be addressed, but so do the microeconomics. My article's about using public development bank guarantees, so-called debt swaps, which have been pioneered for environmental benefit, but never been used for humanitarian benefit. The environmental improvement projects have generated $1.7 billion in 7 countries, buying out debt and using the proceeds that come from having a lower interest payment from a debt guarantee that's provided by a public body like the Development Finance Corporation. You use the difference to put the money into good use. For environment, we'd like to use it in the humanitarian space. There's also disaster risk financing, like parametric insurance, which pays out as soon as triggers are hit for rainfall, and they make for predictable and fast flows of finance. Finally, in this area, there's pressing need to recognize that in a world of more than 40 de facto authorities, that is, non-state actors who control territory, we need to diversify delivery mechanisms beyond the assumption that strengthening government systems will deliver for people in need. If the government's at war in part of its country, strengthening the government health system is not going to deliver better health outcomes in those areas. This is especially true for the international financial institutions led by the World Bank, whose vision of ending poverty cannot be delivered on a livable planet, cannot be delivered until it radically diversifies its delivery model in fragile states to incorporate civil society. Last mile delivery in fragile contexts depends on civil society organizations and their ability to negotiate access in the midst of conflict, their ability to train and organize local staffing, and build trust with war-torn communities. Fourth, accountability for results, for outcomes rather than for inputs, in order to cut bureaucracy, increase flexibility, promote value for money, and drive innovation. The truth is we need governments and international institutions to follow the example of Sweden, which holds us as an NGO accountable for the outcomes that we achieve for people. Educational results, not numbers of teachers trained. Healthy births, not health consultations. Children fed, not food parcels tallied. Need met, not cash distributed. farmers sustained, not seed delivered. Instead of funding individual projects often detached from each other, the income, health, safety, and educational outcomes for people would count more. This would allow more comparison of performance and of value for money from different ways of delivering aid, which would make for the most of the transparency that should be the hallmark of our sector. And for those of you interested in our approach to outcomes and evidence, please go onto our website and look at the outcomes and evidence framework that we publish and keep up to date. Fifth and finally, we do need to spread the aid burden as the shape of the global economy shifts. It's reasonable for the administration here to say that it makes no sense for the G7 group of countries, which account for 45% of global GDP, to pay 75% of the aid bill. For reference, America is 25% of global income, with a percentage of national income devoted to foreign aid now estimated at 0.15% of gross national income, which is low by international developed world standards. It's half that of Italy. But countries that are newly wealthy should be increasing their contribution. Now, I present those 5 areas for focus for the future of the international aid system because I still believe this could be a unifying mission for America and for Americans. As the polling shows, the humanitarian heart of the country still beats strong. If the changes I've outlined are instituted, then the excuses that are used to displace the moral case for aid will be much reduced. Congress has a critical role to play in this, in authorizing funding and overseeing aid efforts. I think it's interesting that the recent House of Representatives budget bill, provides $46 billion for foreign assistance for next year, which is a cut of 22%, which is severe, but it's much, 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 much lower than that suggested by the administration. It also directs effort to a multi-year strategy on aid effectiveness and efforts to promote innovation and accountability, with calls for milestone-based funding and expanded use of evaluations. There's also flex in the budget for the Secretary of State to meet emerging priorities, which if used strategically and well, would be positive. Now, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, and I'm going to end not with numbers, but with a different point. Not a moral point, but a strategic point. Because I think it's worth recognizing that from the beginning, aid has had a strategic purpose, not just a moral purpose. When he set up US aid, President Kennedy put the Cold War front and center. His purpose in relieving poverty was not just to help people in need, it was also to show these people and their leaders that the American way was the better way than Soviet communism. American soft power in all its forms of turning relationships into alliances and an admiration into a model was part of the story of Western aid. Quote unquote, richesse oblige was only part of it. There was a strong strand of self-interest. It was certainly not a case of America second. In today's parlance, President Kennedy's announcement had a clear view of making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Not without moral purpose, but moral purpose joined to strategic intent. Today, obviously, the Cold War of Western and Soviet blocs, plus a lot of non-aligned states, is over. I don't myself see competition with China through the same Cold War lens, although I'm conscious that the dean is an expert in Chinese politics, so I'm going out of my lane. I don't see the competition through a Cold War lens, but I do see competition with China, and where America retreats, there's growing evidence that China is ready to move in. Just in the last month, 2 serious China scholars, Jeffrey Prescott and Julian Gewirtz, have written in Foreign Affairs that, quote, President Xi sees a window of opportunity to forge a China-centric world without directly taking on the United States, by moving assertively into areas where President Trump's America First policies leave openings. They point to the 18 leaders, including, very significantly, India at the Shanghai Cooperation meeting, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, meeting hosted by Brazil with President Xi as keynote speaker. They point to the Chinese cuts in tariffs on Africa as America increased its tariffs on Africa, plus initiatives on global governance, development, and on AI. For me, as the leader of a humanitarian organization, the future of international aid should be driven by the imperative of saving lives, alleviating suffering, and preserving dignity. But I don't mind why countries commit to international aid, as long as they do so according to principles that put crisis-affected people at the center. From my perspective, the future of international aid should be different from the past because the nature and geography of poverty has changed. But as more than 60 conflicts rage around the world, I do have some statistics, I'm sorry. As more than 60 conflicts rage around the world, as impunity takes root, as civilians are more and more the victims of conflict, as rights to aid become increasingly diluted, as 300 million people depend on humanitarian aid to survive, we need to recognize some basic truths. If we can save people from destitution, we should. Those delivering on the ground need to embody commitment to value for money and efficient delivery. The donors need to put clients front and center. The new resources of science and technology should be used to help the world's poorest, not just the richest. We need innovation in service delivery as well as product design. And the Western world has an interest in leading this drive, not in hanging back. Today, 80% of acutely malnourished children in conflict zones are not treated. 60% of maternal deaths in childbirth are in fragile and conflict states. Over 52 million kids in countries affected by conflict are not in school. Effective international aid is the answer to these problems, not the problem itself. There are more resources in the world to do more good than at any time in human history, so it's on us to use the resources wisely. 1% of the federal budget is not excessive. It can be put to good use. It's in America's interest to do so. And from my point of view, the sooner that happens, the better. Thank you very much indeed.